talk is from Dr. Alan Walker on the Sea Trout Working Group. Alan is lead advisor at CFAS on freshwater and diadromous fish, specialising in salmon, sea trout and eels. And his research interests focus on understanding the life history and behaviour of these fish species across a diversity of freshwater, estuarine and marine environments, so that we can improve our assessments of stock status and human impacts, and therefore support the conservation and sustainable use of these key species. So, Alan, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Hopefully, can somebody just say that you can hear me, please?
Yeah, all good, thank you.
Lovely, yeah, because you can see me, but I can't see you. So thanks, Charlotte, and thanks everybody from the organisers for inviting me to speak today. So you've heard about my title, so I'll crack on. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm not here to talk about fish farms. I will mention aquaculture a couple of times, but just to set that from the beginning. 3 parts to the talk. First, to tell you about WGTRUTTA and ICES, what and why, and with the working group, who it is, what they do, and how we do it. Then to look at some of the key activities in our first term, and then to finish up by looking at the activities we've got underway at the moment in our second term. So what is WGTRUTTA? Well, it's the working group to develop and test assessment methods for sea trout populations. It's chaired by Johan Huyeho, who you can see here on the right-hand side, and myself. And it was established in 2017, and it brings together sea trout experts from across its range to work on common challenges. It's hosted by ICES, which is the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. And ICES is an intergovernmental, they call themselves an intergovernmental marine science organization. So I put the aquatic in brackets there, always have to fly the freshwater flag as well. And their mission is to advance scientific understanding of marine and aquatic ecosystems and provide knowledge for sustainable management. And the core activities are in advice, science, and data. But why has ICES got sea trout on its books? Well, actually, in the Baltic, there are EU regulations for all of the fishing in the Baltic Sea itself, and those include the sea trout fisheries in the marine, which are shared stocks from most of the Baltic countries and a number of the fisheries coming from those countries as well. So ICES is commissioned or is contracted by the EU to provide stock advice for the Baltic sea trout every 2 years. And on the panel on the right-hand side, you can see a summary, the sort of headline of the most recent advice. Also, HELCOM, which is an organization that focuses on the environment within the Baltic Sea region. They use the sea trout par densities in their environmental evaluations. So there's a working group in ICES called WG-BAST, which deals with Baltic salmon and sea trout. And they produce annual updates on recruitment status, exploitation and monitoring activities for these roughly 800 sea trout rivers around the Baltic. But outside of the Baltic, there's nothing so sort of well-defined across the international scale. But within the EU, there's a data collection framework which supports countries in collecting data, mostly for marine fisheries, but it also has included salmon and eel for a while, and now from next year, well, from this year actually, it will include sea trout, and those EU countries will be required to collect data on sea trout catches and juvenile and adult abundances. So the international focus is sort of slowly building outside of the Baltic. And ICES set up WGTRUTTA to progress on sea trout assessment and management at these scales and to assist ICES in exploring next steps across its range. And the arrow there is the WGTRUTTA, it kind of feeds into the science end of ICES in particular. So the who of WGTRUTTA, we've got members from all 19 sea trout countries across the natural range, and they include people from government agencies, from institutes, from universities and NGOs. In terms of the what, these are the kind of the long-term objectives of the working group, and we focus on 4 key areas, which are life history drivers and distributions, quantifying external pressures, methods to assess stock and population state, and also solutions to achieve sustainable governance of trout stocks. And in terms of the how, we have a number of workshops. We've got some associated PhDs and partnerships. And actually, the members are obviously, they're doing all of their own research, and all of that we kind of feed on for the work of WGTRUTTA. And it's reported and disseminated through scientific papers, examples on the right-hand side, reports on the ICES website, and presentations. And these workshops, they used to include site visits before COVID came along, and hopefully they will again. But they also include presentations, updates from the membership on, what they're doing with sea trout in the last 6 months or a year. And these updates have included topics like sea trout genetics, both in terms of sea trout populations and in sex ratios. So the ratios of males and females within sea trout smolts and returning adults. Obviously, migratory behaviours and habitat use and tracking in rivers and estuaries in the sea is a big one, and the importance of estuaries as transition zones. We also hear about monitoring programmes from as far north as Norway down to Portugal, and some research going on in the South Pacific. So we get to at least see something a bit further afield. And we hear about new PhDs, sea trout population modelling, and state and risk classifications like the traffic light system that Norway is adopting. So in terms of activities in the first term, which was 2017 to 2019, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that we did on life histories, and then also on stock assessment approaches. So the key thing for life histories is that we produced a review paper. You can see the front page here on the right-hand side, which is reviewing what was known about environmental influences on life history. And this summarizes, is basically a review of the literature as a whole, and then looking at the life history data from 6 populations across Europe. And looked at factors influencing survival and growth and how they determine life history. And so included considerations of competition, feeding and sheltering opportunities, both in freshwater and the marine, temperature effects and flow conditions. And recognizing that relationships within sea trout of growth, size, and reproductive success are different between males and females. So that brings challenges. And also there are short reviews on some of the key challenges, which include the climate change, and recognizing that the more southern populations are particularly sensitive to climate change, although there will be local effects, no doubt, throughout the whole range. Other pressures like fisheries and aquaculture, obstacles to migration, coastal developments, and declining and degrading habitat quantity and quality, and of course new species introductions as well. And some of the gaps that were identified, or not identified, as such, just recognized. There's very limited data on resident trout within sea trout rivers. So to compare the two. And of course, linked to that, it's very challenging to identify the origin of juveniles and you need to be able to predict their future life history. And growth rate it's not quite a simple predictor. Then if we look at the stock assessment approaches, and there's 3 different approaches that we looked at here. We start with the classical fish stock assessments based on stock recruitment relationships and reference states and reference points. And these were tested on 10 data-rich rivers that you can see in the panel on the right-hand side here. These included, really quite small rivers, large rivers, and a few that have large lochs in them as well. And it's stock recruitment relationships. So stock was defined as eggs deposited, and largely that was derived from adult counts, from catches, but also from metrics on fish size, sex ratio, and fecundity. And then recruits were defined as smolt output, and in most places that's either trapping for counting, or indices based on par. And just some of the comparisons. Close a window on my screen. There we go. Compare egg production, huge range in egg production. You can see there from over 5,000 to only 22 per 100 meters squared. Smolt production varying from 800 to 8 smolts per hectare, and survival from egg to smolt varying from 3.7 down to 0.2% in these 10 rivers. One of the obvious findings was that there's low smolt production rates, at least when you standardize for area, from rivers with these large deep lochs. And I noticed that we heard about that yesterday from one of the rivers up in the northwest, if I remember rightly, about a very few smolt production from that river compared to others nearby. Caveats to all of this, of course, if we still got this sea trout versus resident trout contributions question, the conundrum of how you look at any part of the population component and understand how the sea trout and the resident have contributed. And the other thing is that we're looking at long time series here, and of course things change, the environment changes, conditions change over time. So it's difficult to address and account for those changes over time, and they can bring in uncertainties. So that's about the state, but then this leads to making biological reference points, and that needs curve fitting. And the panels on the right hand side here show two curve relationships that are applied, and they work for some stocks and not nearly so well for others. But some of the questions we come up with, as I mentioned, is how to measure productive area. That's definitely an outstanding question, and particularly the contribution of lochs. And also recognizing that these stock the monitoring that's involved in deriving a long-term time series for a stock recruitment relationship are certainly data hungry and very expensive. So conclusions in terms of overall is that this one size fits all thing is probably very unlikely for sea trout, and therefore we most likely need a toolkit. Then if we look at some alternative approaches, obviously that was data rich, but data limited situations are much more common. And if we look at an alternative approach from the marine world, is length-based indicators. And I'm pretty sure we heard yesterday, this question about comparing and contrasting abundance versus fish size, and that, size matters. And the panel on the right shows a very simple schematic of a situation, a metric, where if you've got few small fish, then it's a bad situation compared to more big fish in the green up in the top right corner. So we applied size and abundance data or indices from catches and traps and counters to this approach, and used different metrics of the average size of fish in the population compared to a baseline. And this idea was developed using data from the Welsh Dee, but then it was subsequently applied to rivers in France, Ireland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Sweden. And it gives an overview of the changes in stock structure. And this is the panel on the bottom right, shows the changes over time in these three rivers in terms of size metrics. And it also, as well as seeing how it changes over time, it sort of gives you an indication of the direction of change. But it's really a sort of a qualitative thing, and it's an illustrative thing, a tool that can be a guide. And of course, when you see all these changes, then you still need some sort of contextual understanding of what drives these changes. You also need a baseline in order to decide where's your red and where's your green. And so that's a challenge. These ones are all they're all standardized against the best or highest values in the time series, but that relies on the fact that those represent the pristine at some point. And of course, if you don't get the data until everything's changed a lot, you won't have the pristine. And the last one, the big conceptual one is, well, actually, what is the ideal size structure for any sea trout population? Do we want lots of big fish, or a few big fish and lots of medium-sized fish? So on those kind of questions still to be answered. Look at the third one, which is based on juvenile data. And here, this is the trout habitat scores approach, which was developed for use in the Baltic. And it's actually, this is one of the components of the Baltic sea trout stock assessment, which is made across, you see all the black dots are the data sources here, and the ovals, the round shapes there, those are the different kind of management units for salmon and sea trout in the Baltic itself. And this evaluates observed versus potential fry and par densities and looks at these in relation to habitat characteristics, and I've listed a few there. What we'd like to do is to somehow take that, take it outside of the Baltic, which is what's happening just now, but also take it from fry and par to smolt production carrying capacities and look into that, see if we have that. But of course, the challenges continue, and it's a running theme through the whole presentation: residents versus sea trout in this juvenile production. In the Baltic area, they tend to effectively think that all of the juvenile trout are sea trout, and they just go from there. But we know that in other parts outside in the Atlantic area, that's clearly not the case, and needs to be a more sort of a more complicated and complex way of looking at the juveniles. There's also an issue over, or potential issues over, the way that the juvenile data are collected, of course. So standardizing and being able to calibrate and compare them is useful. And then if we just look briefly at work in progress at the moment, those 4 areas that I talked about right at the beginning of the talk, we're investigating life history drivers and the distribution of sea trout and freshwater trout populations around rivers. And as I said, this is because there's just too many rivers and too many sea trout stocks, and they're too different to go for, one size fits all approach. But we still, I haven't actually seen a number, but what must be thousands of sea trout rivers, we still need to break that down into manageable chunks. So how do we do that? How do we characterize these river and stock types? And at the same time as we're doing this in WG-BAST for the Baltic area, they're looking at defining rules for sea trout index rivers where they can target their monitoring. And obviously those 2 work streams are very closely related. And alongside all of this is this question of how does habitat influence sea trout distribution within rivers. Second one is quantifying pressures, and we'll be hearing a lot about pressures for the remainder of this session, and we heard about some yesterday. So the pressures are diverse. They're obviously in freshwater, estuaries, in the sea, and we've got natural and human activities. WG-BAST in the Baltic, actually, in their advice, they categorize them as overexploitation, habitat degradation, damming, and pollution. But obviously, there's other considerations outside there of aquaculture and predation and high water temperatures, low water, and disease. And it's sort of conceptually easy to think about these as the effects on an individual fish. But for the stock assessment and management, we need to be thinking about them in terms of the effects on the populations. And also we need to be able to understand the combined effects of these pressures in different ones. So that's what we're looking at, is how do we quantify these levels of impacts at a population scale? And do we need more or new data, or certainly a better understanding? And we're exploring the distribution and the effects of impacts across these multiple regional scales. And then the third one is developing this toolbox of assessment methods. And I described the 3 different assessment approaches that we had from the first term. So we're looking now to extend those out and test them in new rivers, in wider areas, and develop guidance on how they can be applied and what's required for them to be applied in other areas. And we've sort of internally posed ourselves a challenging question. Was, if we were asked tomorrow to give a status assessment for sea trout across the whole of its range, how would we do that? How would we approach that? So we're looking into that at present. And that's kind of almost in a parallel, although it's not linked in any way, to the IUCN listing and the considerations for Atlantic salmon that are going on at the moment. It's the same kind of, going from your river up to your multi-regional assessments. And lastly, of course, bringing all this together to achieve sustainable governance of trout stocks, and with looking at the challenges of governance and trying to derive the scientific solutions. And we're going to bring in social and economic expertise here, because WGTRUTTA at the moment is a whole bunch of sea trout experts, but they're not people experts, so to speak. So we're bringing in the social and economic expertise and the governance, and look at how sea trout can fit into this ICES approach. What are the key ecological, social, economic management objectives? What are the acceptable levels of risk in all of this? Because clearly, nothing is definitive, and there has to be a risk around every management decision. And therefore, what are the management strategy options? And these are definitely questions for the future, but things that are on our mind. So just like to conclude at this point and say thanks very much for listening, everybody. I can't see you. I hope you're not asleep. But just to finish off with saying, how could you help if you were interested in helping? We're definitely interested in new data and new information on sea trout stocks, and we're not covering everything, so we'd love to hear on that. And also, if you've got particular ideas on the challenges of sea trout governance. If you want to know more about the working group, best thing to do is kind of Google the working group on the ICES website. So if you do a search, Google or Bing or whatever you use for WGTRUTTA and ICES, on my Google it's the top of the search list. So hopefully it would be for you as well. And if you want to know more about what's happening in the Baltic, WGBAST and ICES will be the same. And then just a reminder that the 3 papers we did last time are listed there in the bottom left-hand panel. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk, and I will stop presenting now.